Hello, welcome to the first Sober Man's Addendum. This is an educational segment dedicated to value adding and adding content to what we cover in our main podcast episodes. The podcast episodes are kind of like discussions between the hosts that prioritize contextualizing topics in anime and manga settings. These settings are unlikely to paint a representative picture of the full scale and nuances of the topics discussed. Even worse, mild inebriation does hinder our ability to discuss the topic in depth, hence the need for an addendum. As the namesake implies, sober means that we drink only water during the episode. You may consider these episodes info dumps, so if you would like to just soak in the background noise of our recitations rather than conversations, these episodes will be absolute bangers in that regard. I just want to add a disclaimer that what we say is never the gospel truth, and only our perspectives and understanding of the topics that we discuss, based on whatever we have learned from personal experiences and from consuming the content of other people. We'll try to keep things understandable for the layman weeb, so let's begin the dive into nerd stuff. This episode of the Sober Man's Addendum will prioritize the fitness stuff. We did have both fitness and sociology topics in the pilot, and the first fitness episode was a very, ranty nerd episode. This episode is gonna deal with anime training. Yep, the kind that you see in anime exercise motivation AMVs. Before we get into that, we need to work our ways through semantics and understanding in terms of fitness. To begin, I have a model that I invented for the sake of illustrating what I refer to as my meta perspective on exercise, in that the about perspective on exercise. The model begins with a grey box. This box represents an absolute limit that is the foundation of this model, i.e., this box represents all possible anatomical movements of the human body, accounting for individual anatomical differences. Within exercise science literature, external observations to the human body are done in a two-dimensional plane by observing perpendicularly to the midline of the body. Planar movements at the joints are named, such as hip extension, elbow flexion, horizontal abduction. I want to make a point that, in reality, it is important to understand that while these movements are viewed and examined in two-dimensional planes, our bodies operate in a three-dimensional world, and that many exercises cannot be analyzed simply through looking at one plane of view. This is the very first step to understanding what exercise is, by understanding that exercises are human body movements in 3D space. Next, we can imagine a big circle. This first circle is orange in color. The colors won't mean anything, I just need 5 colors. And it's an ever-expanding circle within the gray box. The first circle is an ever-expanding circle that represents all possible exercises based on existing equipment or the lack thereof. The first circle is ever-expanding because innovation in exercises takes place here. More equipment, machines, and tools are being developed as a means to induce positive exercise outcomes. Whenever a new tool that creates a new exercise is produced, the first circle expands. Where imagination ends, or the extinction of the human race, is the end point where the circle stops expanding. The first circle indicates that, based on the foundation of possible joint movements, we invent tools and organize movements in a way to create what we will eventually name an exercise. After the first orange circle comes the second red circle. This circle represents exercises that are conducive for attaining positive fitness outcomes. Generally, you need to first define fitness. Like I mentioned in the principles episode, fitness can be discretely categorized into 2 types: health-based fitness like muscular strength and cardiovascular endurance, and skill-based fitness like power and coordination. If actually performed in an intentional manner, most exercises are useful in some way or another for creating positive training outcomes. However, some exercises are better than others by way of design. Tools have limitations in their design, and it is an issue of what I call practicality versus optimality. The exercises that are on the end of the spectrum that are more effective by way of design can be considered more conducive for attaining fitness outcomes. Returning to semantics, exercises are simply organized movements of the human body. By definition, actions such as stir-frying, self-pleasuring, beating, or tenderizing meat would technically be considered exercises. However, unconventional exercises at that, these will fall within the first orange circle, as they are not exactly conducive for attaining positive fitness outcomes, even though their performance may actually result in it. Their performance is, firstly, not planned, and secondly, is difficult to plan in a manner as to induce an exercise outcome. If the arm that is responsible for the aforementioned actions has a hypertrophic or strength adaptation from the performance, that's nice. However, no one is going to go off their way to plan. So the first month, use a 1 kg frying pan, second month 1.2 kg frying pan, third month 1.5 kg frying pan, in a bid to develop bigger forearms from stir frying. You may have heard the term mechanic's arm. A sufficient volume of self-pleasuring may actually result in a disproportionately bigger and stronger arm for specific movements. Now, something of note is that the second circle does not necessarily expand as the first circle does. That is because to evaluate whether a new exercise is conducive to inducing positive exercise outcomes, some evidence is needed to justify it. That is where we can use the hierarchy of evidence. When an exercise or equipment is designed or prototyped, a proposed mechanism for creating a positive exercise outcome has to be present. Once the mechanism can be established, marketing gets the word out and creates potential or hype. People buy into the potential or hype and invest in trying it out. Over time, people may or may not have tangible, positive exercise outcomes. This contributes the initial piece of anecdotal evidence. Recordings of the training variables, such as load intensity and volume for the exercise, are the first form of statistical data we can work with. This is often something coaches will possess. Analyses based on these datasets from various athletes are used to further develop understanding on how to perform the exercise to produce positive exercise outcomes with respect to the training variables. A deep analysis with the scientific method can attempt to isolate the variables to get the best understanding. Granted, there are limitations to experiment designs and statistical analysis processes. Hence, multiple studies that are generalizable must be done to form a coherent, objective body of evidence to then be synthesized. Generally, as more high-quality evidence is produced, the exercise moves from the outer fringe of the first circle towards the inner fringe, approaching the second circle. If all the previous evidence supports the exercise, it can, with high certainty, be added to the second circle from the first circle. Many of the exercises that already exist within the second circle have been well validated from the past 50 years or so. Millions of people have performed some of the most well-known exercises, such as the barbell bench press, the barbell squat, pull-ups, and have found ways to make them conducive for hypertrophy or strength outcomes. Are there better options? Yes. Tools that are more effective for the intended outcome have been created over the years, coming to life in the first circle and being evaluated through a hierarchy of evidence and testing before settling into the second circle. That does not mean that while a better alternative exists, the older, less effective or efficient alternative needs to be removed from the second circle. Sometimes You just don't have access to the equipment needed to perform it. After the second red circle comes a third green circle, which represents the exercises you could possibly do presently based on the equipment currently available or the lack thereof. You may or may not know how to perform said exercise with the equipment available, although it is possible for you to learn how to. With time and experience, you could come to learn how to do every single possible movement with every single piece of equipment available in the environment you're in. For example, a person in the gym would have access to a variety of free weights, cable machines with various attachments, cardio machines, and other tools like resistance bands, Swiss balls, jumping ropes, etc. The third green circle can increase or decrease in size due to many different reasons, such as the addition of new training equipment, spoilage of training equipment, or an injury that limits the exercises you can do now. Lastly is a fourth blue circle. This circle represents all the exercises presently being performed, like the exercises in a workout or a training program. These exercises are a limited selection of exercises that fall within the third green circle. While it is technically possible for you to do all the exercises within the third green circle, you can only afford to do so many exercises within a workout while producing positive training adaptations. Hence, the fourth circle. The fourth circle is a product of an exercise selection process. As you move on in your fitness life cycle, exercises within the fourth circle can be exchanged with the third circle. Thankfully, some exercises are always available. Calisthenics that require only the floor, like bodyweight squats, push-ups, crunches, etc. Unless you are stranded floating in space for an extended period of time. From what I understand, most laymen understand exercise through the third and fourth circles. They are usually unaware of the first and second circles and the grey box. That is because they are taught by other people or find workouts online to do. Hence, their exercise thought process may look like this. For those who viewed the third circle, they would think something along these lines. I have all these equipment available where I work out. I'll do what I know how to do. And for those who have narrowed down to the fourth circle, they might think something like this. I'll do the exercises in this program or as the coach tells me to. If I don't know what the exercise is, I'll do something else. Unsurprisingly, to be cognizant of the grey box, you need to know functional anatomy. Like I said, it is the foundation of exercise, how the body moves in 3D space. The second circle requires both knowledge, particularly from the niche field of exercise science, and experience, usually in the form of did it work for you and how. The first circle requires you to be up to date with the marketing or promotions of fitness equipment, like those on crowdsourcing platforms like Kickstarter or equipment innovators like Kabuki Barbell. As a coach, I have to see the bigger picture, which is why I can create this model and share it with you. The model represents my understanding of exercise and my process when designing programs. Knowing the grey box, you apply your knowledge of functional anatomy by taking note of the unique physical traits of your client. Anthropometrics like their height, weight, limb lengths, any contraindications brought about by anatomical differences like the type of hip joints they have. These are some of the things we have to take into consideration. When I enter the first circle, I think, what new, better tools are there? Do I have access to them? Deeper into the second circle, I do think of this. Of the new tools that I want to use, is there evidence to support their usage? Do I know how to program it to be useful for my clients' goals? In third circle, things get a bit more on the ground. I have to ask the questions like, where does my client train? And do they have a good set of tools or a not as good set of tools? Or do they only have the bare minimum tools? Once I have elucidated that, I can go into the fourth circle of thinking. For their program, I'll organize several sequences or patterns of tool usage. Read tool exercise. If the tools aren't working as well, I change them around to see if it works better. Should you, the viewer, decide to adopt this model, you would be immune to clickbait such as the only 3 back exercises you need to build muscle or redundant biceps exercises you don't need. Now, I have 2 final points to make. Firstly, there are several taxonomies out there that can assist with the decision making, the exercise selection process. For example, Coach Chasm from N1 Education has a 5-variable taxonomy that helps form a hierarchy of exercises for the same muscle group. These variables are stability, loadability, muscular bias, range of motion, and best available resistance. You'll find many of these taxonomies online, and you can use it to help select better exercises. Secondly, you should form a personal hierarchy of exercises. This will give you options when the environment is not as ideal. Finally, I would add that exercise selection is a first step, and program design needs to come afterwards, structuring exercises in a way that does not self-sabotage the training process or workout itself, while accounting for accumulated fatigue over the span of the workout and abiding to the training principles. Well, speaking of the training principles, learning about and how to apply the training principles has been a life changer, especially as someone who never had a coach. I think this is where I share what I could consider an embarrassing past regarding exercise. So there was a period of my life where I was doing real anime training. Back then, Real Anime Training was the name of a blog founded by a coach called Stephen Ross. He made workouts based on either character feats in anime and manga, or he would make workouts based on a character's physique. One such workout that I did as a routine was something called the Goku Gravity Room workout. It was quite a simple workout consisting of 10 rounds of 10 push-ups, 10 squats, followed by 1 minute of shadowboxing. A simple yet effective way of getting some activity done for the day. Other more exotic workouts would be things like the Baki newspaper workout. In Baki Son of Ogre, there was a scene in the manga that was the inspiration for this. Baki scrunched up full pages of a newspaper and juggled the newspaper balls formed with his fist. Apparently, it was a strongman practice in the past to warm up the grip in the morning by scrunching up a page of newspaper and gripping it as hard as possible. The ball was compressible up to a certain point and then pushed back like it would a stress ball. So I did the same thing back when newspapers were actually made of paper and not online subscriptions. Some other weird stuff that I did from this were one-arm knuckle planks from Karate Shokoshi Koinata Minoru, Rock Lee's style of training where he set an impossible number of repetitions to be done and moved to an alternative exercise whenever he failed, and Ippo's Tekken training with a makeshift hammer and a punching bag. Understandably, most of these workouts were not made with practical training in mind. Rather, they were homages or inspired workouts from anime and manga. In a time where I was relatively uneducated in training, it was hard for me to bring about good adaptations from doing them. This is mostly because these workouts were not designed around the training principles, and I did not know how to apply these principles to make it work out. Perhaps I ought to give a recap of the principles covered in the Anime, Alcohol and Principles podcast. The training principles I covered were adapted from the Scientific Principles of Strength and Hypertrophy Training as written by Dr. Mike Israetel from Renaissance Periodization. But first, let's start with the principle or concept that is external to the books, periodization. Periodization, I best describe it with a twofold definition. It is firstly, the separation of training into phases or periods, followed by the manipulation of training variables across these phases or periods to achieve a specific training outcome. I abridged this definition from Dr. Mike Zordos from an episode on the Iron Culture podcast. The next principle I want to cover is overload. As I mentioned in the episode, I best adapt and understand the definition of overload based on the one given by Brian Miner in the paper reply to the article by Israetel et al., Mesocycle Progression in Hypertrophy, Volume versus Intensity. I would use the definition of overload as, quote-unquote, imposing a stimulus sufficient for an adaptive response. Therefore, progressive overload is better understood as a noun in this regard, where repeated bouts of a stimulus that elicits an adaptive response are evident over the span of a training phase. Progressive overload as a verb is often taken as an increase to specific training variables such as load and volume, but I rather use the term matter of progression. Next, the principle of specificity. The full name of the principle is specific adaptations to impose demands. The easy way to describe what that means is you get better at what you do. How I will describe it would be that you get better at a specific task and at a range of specific variables applicable to the task. Specificity, funnily enough, is integral to the process of learning. And the task nature can be both mental and physical. In fitness, the salient task is physical. However, you can train both certain mental and cognitive abilities through exposure to a well-designed cognitive training program. Back to a more relevant example. The definition of a physical task is quite loose, and thus the nature of specificity can be applied across many contexts. But before I can get into specificity, I want to first rant my way through some other semantics. I should start by saying that doing exercise can generally be called physical activity. The term is broad and covers things like taking a walk, carrying groceries, and climbing the stairs. The term exercise often deals with a nature of planning. Exercise is planned physical activity. So if I were to just stand up and start pacing about, that would be physical activity. If I planned to take a walk every morning after waking up, that would be exercise. Training often pertains to a goal, which is an objective outcome, and the direction of effort towards achieving the goal. So, detracting back to the walking example, it could be that I plan to walk every alternate morning, starting with an arbitrary 2,000 steps in 30 minutes, with the goal of walking 4,000 steps every day in 40 minutes, which may translate to a walking speed of 4.5 kilometers per hour from 3 kilometers per hour. Based on exercise variables, this would count as a volume and speed goal with a secondary goal of consistency in taking those morning walks. This is a good representation of what training means. As a mild caveat, these definitions are contextualized to the self. If someone planned to make you do a random set of 20 push-ups for the intention of punishment, would you really consider that training or even exercise? You can think about it. So, recap. The three principles or concepts I covered are, once again, periodization, overload, and specificity. These concepts can be applied across a range of variables. However, I'm only going to talk about exercises and thus real anime training. Specificity in exercises mainly pertains to fitness outcomes like strength and hypertrophy. Some exercises are more conducive to expressing and developing strength by way of their form or design, while some exercises are more conducive for creating hypertrophy outcomes by way of, say, the variables I mentioned from Coach Kassem's taxonomy earlier. They could be more stable, allowing for more force production. They could work through a larger exercise range of motion, and they could have greater loadability, allowing fractional plates to be used or equivalent. To get stronger at an exercise, you have to train using that exercise and with a good progression method and model. However, variations can be applied to make up for innate design flaws of the exercise. I'll provide a case study, the barbell bench press. A strong barbell bench press typically has a large arch in the trunk. This prevents the barbell from operating through the working muscles full length and the joint's full range of motion. This may result in weakness at longer lengths. A cambered bar will provide a suitable variation that can strengthen the muscles at their weaker lengthened position, resulting in a stronger barbell bench press from the lengthened position, i.e. the bottom of the lift. This is just one example of how to work around specificity with variations. The core of the work should still be the barbell bench press, as sufficient volume and intensity of training with the equipment is necessary to retain and develop strength. We add in the variation to supplement that. Exercises better at creating muscle hypertrophy are those that are specific to those muscles. For example, barbell squats and machine leg extensions. Barbell squats, because of the hip extension component of the exercise, prevents the rectus femoris, one of the heads of the quadriceps that works as both a leg extensor and hip flexor, from contracting maximally in leg extension by way of reciprocal inhibition. The seated leg extension machine gets rid of the hip extension component, allowing all four heads, including the rectus femoris, to contract maximally to perform leg extension. To fully develop all four heads of the quadriceps, you should apply both of the aforementioned exercises unless contraindicated. That briefly summarizes specificity in exercises. Next is overload in exercises. Generally, two variables are the easiest to manipulate to achieve overload. There will be volume and intensity/loading. Volume is simply a measure of the amount of work done. A simple example would be just the product of reps and sets. 3 sets of 10 reps gives 30 reps done. Loading generally applies to exercises with external loads. Some tools are straightforward. Free weights are lumps of metal weighing whatever weight they are. 20 kg, 10 kg, 5 kg. Cable machines have a free stack of weights, but the tension of the cables and pulley system can alter the actual forces being opposed. So while it's fairly accurate to the weight of the weight stack, it may be more. Things like resistance bands are elastic and have a range of loading based on the length of the stretch band. Flywheels depend on the inertia of the flywheel to provide loading, making it very difficult to measure at any one point in time. Intensity, as the definition is equated colloquially to loading, are things like heart rate zones. I'm not too well versed with this side of things, so I generally stick to talking about loading. Intensity in another setting is used to determine a tool called autoregulation. That is a whole other topic by itself. To overload an exercise, one needs to present a stimulus that leads to adaptation. This is usually achieved by increments to volume of the same load or an increase in load for the same volume. In some cases, the workout enables both variables to be increased. Depending on the type of stimulus, the body can adapt accordingly based on the type of fitness trait. A sufficient volume of high levels of mechanical tension and a hypertrophic adaptation can be induced. Sufficient volume of movement practice at a certain power and velocity output, and strength and power adaptations can occur. While these aren't the only stimuli that may lead to adaptation, it will get too convoluted to give more. especially when I'm not going to explain and go through what each of these stimuli are. As a last note to overload, that is the case of what people commonly refer to as overtraining. In the fitness sphere, the term is best known as overreaching. Overreaching indicates a case where fitness levels fail to return to baseline after exposure to a stimulus, i.e. training. Overtraining, apparently, is when this state persists and does not return to baseline over a long period of time. Overreaching is usually temporary and could be a case of too much volume or poor recovery. What is usually important in this context is that the stimulus fails to result in a positive adaptation and has instead created maladaptation, i.e. overload was not achieved. Next is periodization. As periodization mostly deals with the aforementioned training variables like intensity and volume, exercises can be adjusted based on the phase of training. Simple example. In an overall training cycle over a year, there could be 4 training phases or so. These phases could alternate between different training outcome goals. For example, muscle hypertrophy, into strength, into sport-specific skill development, into peaking. The coach would then create programs accordingly for each athlete or the team. Exercises conducive to each goal would be rotated in before having variables adjusted to create positive training outcomes. Now, I covered the concept of the training arc when I talked about periodization. Inherent to many shonen anime and manga is the fact that protagonists and their friends, and maybe even the villains, undergo training, whether it be physical or mental training. What matters is that it is often adapted from reality. After all, mangaka and story writers are all humans who have learned how training occurs from their own perspectives. I'd say someone like One, who wrote One Punch Man, the webcomic, has a simpler understanding of exercise compared to someone like George Morikawa, who is at this point in time still writing Hajime no Ippo. As evident from what was popular for a period of time, the One Punch Man workout, One has a rather limited range of exercises given, likely because they are easy, well-known exercises that are super relatable to a mainstream audience. George Morikawa owns his own boxing gym, which reflects in the specific types of training the characters in Hajime no Ippo perform. They are more complex with greater adherence to the training principles. For example, Saitama's 100 push-ups, squats, sit-ups, and 10 km of running for 3 years is in grievous violation of the principles. First, he is devoid of periodization, as he is devoid of hair. Secondly, not only are the exercises too general and do not even provide full training coverage of the body, like, where's your back training, bro? Violating specificity. Saitama also does the same volume for each exercise per workout, violating overload. Understandably, he does the same workout but faster. However, there are limits to how this improved proficiency for the same exercises affect adaptations from training in reality. So while technically you could get slight improvements to fitness from getting faster for the same volume, there are inherent limitations in the design of the exercises chosen. And yes, I do get that this workout exists solely to play the gag of how he both got bald and attained his illogical yet undefeatable gag power. I gave the example of Hajime no Ippo in the actual podcast episode, which paints a good representation of all the principles and concepts. Ippo has an off and on season phasic training design, where training is tailored to defeat each opponent in a boxing match. Afterwards comes a off season where he does a lot of general conditioning. His training workload increases in volume and intensity as he got fitter and as the story progressed. Faster running speeds for more laps, heavier loads to the weights that he lifts, thus achieving overload over his active career. The Dempsey Rose training with the tennis balls was the highlight example of specificity. Now, I'm sure that many of you will ask with regard to real anime training, will reality stomp apart fantasy, or will fantasy overstep reality? Just kidding, I stole that from a Bucky scanlation just because it sounded cool. Like I mentioned earlier, I've done several weird real anime training sessions. The chief reason I started off this episode ranting about exercise and providing a model of understanding for it was because real anime training, or anime workouts, whatever you want to call it, are still derived ultimately from existing exercises. You don't need super in-depth exercise science knowledge to work around real anime training in a way that will both 1. Give you positive fitness outcomes, and 2. Be fun and entertaining and lets you live your fantasy. Before we even talk about how to do real anime training, I'll analyze the nature of real anime training workouts and programs in the lens of the training principles. The real anime training workouts by Stephen Ross are not inherently designed in a manner that would achieve progressive overload, and there's a very simple general observation for why. The workouts are designed as challenges which test fitness more so than build fitness. They are very much like CrossFit hero workouts in that design. Very high volume, high intensity circuits, or just straight up super high volumes for exercises in a sequence, kind of like a chipper. A chipper is a term used for long high volume workouts that you chip away at. For example, 10 exercises with 50 repetitions each. I get the rationale for why his workouts are designed this way. After all, the real anime training workouts were modeled and designed for superhuman characters and their feats, and thus demanded a workload that would reflect the fantasy. The metric of observing overload for such kinds of workouts is the time taken to complete them. Since workload is always equal from the previous to the next time you attempt it, how quickly you can do it is the indicator of fitness. Now, I do believe that specificity was somewhat adhered to in the creation of real anime training workouts. By keeping the exercise selection and volume and intensity of training similar to what was expected of the character in question, one could realistically develop the muscles used in the manner of the character. For example, knuckle push-ups for a karateka character are pretty realistic, as are Hindu squats and planks. These are general exercises that are endemic in the karate training culture for conditioning the body and thus fitness, and may lend itself to hypertrophy outcomes, although significantly limited, and have a somewhat realistic translation to karate technique performance. However, could I realistically try to periodize such trainings? After all, they are sole workouts. Going with an assumption of periodizing without an intentional peaking period, you can logically periodize real anime training based on the qualities you intend to develop. While you can still do some real anime training workouts, you should modify exercises and variables to ensure that you still create adaptations while having fun living the fantasy. The only limitation is, as in the aforementioned overload segment, real anime training workouts are not conducive to positive training outcomes by design. So here's where I would do things differently compared to the past in order to blend the fantasy and reality. This is where exercise science meets fictional feats. Realistically, you would stick to one central character and the image of their fitness. This helps set a clear goal, but at least choose a character that is somewhat grounded in reality based in fitness. You will never be Yujiro, but maybe you could settle for chapter 425 Ippo. Okay, that's still tough. We can identify characteristics of the character you want to attain, typically by looking at their feats. Not feet for those degenerates out there, feats. For example, Valmir from Jormungandr has very impressive, somewhat grounded in reality feats, doing 100 one-arm push-ups for both arms before transitioning to a handstand. That would be the super elite level of fitness of a female professional mercenary. This, I think, is a somewhat good representation of both realism and fantasy. It would be very, almost obscenely difficult to attain such a level of fitness. However, it is possible to actually chart a path there. Whether someone can live up to it is another issue. Now, don't just settle for one feat at that. Have several so that you can plan and thus periodize training to attain it. Now, I'm going to give a somewhat long-winded example. If I lacked equipment, perhaps I would settle for something like this. For the goal and element of fantasy, I would choose the One Punch Man workout. That sets a realistic ceiling for me. Okay, no, I will add the assumption that I can already run 10 km since I would never bother with that in real life and I will not be fit enough to run 10 km. My goals can thus be represented as such. To have the muscular endurance to be able to do 100 push-ups, sit-ups and squats, then 10 km of running. If you don't know what these exercises are, first start by touching grass outside, then watching One Punch Man. You won't regret it. In order to drive my progress to being able to do the One Punch Man workout in reality, aka being as fit as Saitama, I need to get not just more muscular endurance, but to also be stronger. Thus, as an extension to this entire training program, I set some calisthenics, strength and power goals. For example, being able to do 5 proper one-arm push-ups, just kidding, I can already do 10, and 20 pull-ups with a dead stop, do 20 dragon flags, and to do a muscle up. Overall, we can see at this point that there are a combination of strength, endurance, and looking cool and flexing on others' goals. The training to be fit enough to do 100 push-ups, sit-ups, and squats is fairly hard enough as is. Just think about it. How many people can do 100 strict push-ups in a row? The core of your training, abiding by specificity, will be to still do push-ups, sit-ups, and squats. Needless to say, you probably won't be able to do the whole workout at the start. I would advise against trying to do so by accumulating reps in a manner of doing, say, 10 sets of 10 reps to hit the overall 100 push-ups. Instead, you should perform sets that bring you close to failure and drive overload by increasing volume over time from session to session, usually through the number of reps in however many sets you are doing. Now, this isn't the absolute best and it isn't the most nuanced way of doing things, but I shan't give any further explanations. Setting strength goals like the one-arm push-up, dragon flag, and muscle up will give cause to do variations, such as harder variations of the aforementioned exercises like diamond push-ups, archer push-ups, split squats, leg raises, chest to bar pull-ups, etc. These are variations similar to push-ups, squats, and sit-ups. You can introduce these harder variations after a cycle of training of just push-ups, sit-ups, and squats, incrementally increasing the amplitude of the stimulus to create further new adaptations. That is how I would do things if I were to give it in a step-by-step process. First, choose an anime or manga character goal based on their fitness. Second, establish their feats in the form of a workout. Third, select exercises that will help attain the goal, program them in a suitable training program, and periodize the phases of training that leads to the goal. Fourth, execute the program and have fun. Now, other ways that you can have fun would be to, well, at least in my perspective of fun, in the midst of your realistic training program, account for the possible effects of fatigue and, well, try out other anime character inspired workouts. Do the first 2 steps of the aforementioned process, that is to choose your initial base anime manga character goal and their feats in the form of a workout. Then do that For example, if I am currently on a 3-day program to achieve the fitness to do the One Punch Man workout, I could always find a way to throw in some other fun stuff. I'm a fan of cycling, especially from when I watch Yowamushi Paddle. After all, I own a bike that is inspired by one of the characters. Perhaps on my 3rd workout day, instead of doing just squats and running 10 km, I take the time to go for a 50-kilometer spin up some mountainous regions. Well, Mount Faber is not a mountain, but it's the Singaporean equivalent for Everesting. It's just, slightly more than 300 kilometers of hill climbs. That's a wrap for the first episode of the Sober Man's Addendum. I covered first my meta perspective on exercise, recapped the training principles as I covered them in the Anime, Alcohol and Principles podcast episode. You should check that out. Afterwards, I talked about my history with real anime training and how I would improve upon it, and how you can experiment and play around with the concept of real anime training. You just need to first establish a character base that you want to model after, codify their feats in the form of a workout, and then design a training program that can realistically take you to that goal while adding in some additional fun stuff inspired from other anime characters. Now, if you want more content on how to actually design training programs, I can cover that. After all, no hair off my back, anyone can design a program. But to actually design a good program, you need personal experience across many exercises and sessions. Comment on this video or our social media if you want another Sober Man's Addendum like that. That marks the end of the first episode of the Sober Man's Addendum Real Anime Training Edition. Please, if you enjoyed the video, like, share, and subscribe.